Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Veronica Goodchild, author and Jungian analyst. So welcome, Veronica.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I must say I'm not a Jungian analyst.
Oh,
I did try to train as one and get the piece of paper, but my dreams didn't quite support that move for me. However, I was honored to be elected a member of the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts in the States. So I'm an affiliate
so
member.
should have I just said analyst and author?
You could say psychotherapist. I have been a Jungian psychotherapist for many, many years. That would be more accurate. So
okay, cool. Veronica, today we're talking about a few. We were just chatting before, and it'd be great to talk about. I know you've had some incredible experiences whilst walking. Lots of dreams, powerful dreams, experiences of Egypt, the Blue Rose path. So hopefully we can get towards some of those things, right? God willing. But first, I always start asking someone about some of their influences and turning points, some of their own story. And I just wondered whether we could maybe start there.
Yes. Okay, let's just dive in. Where shall I begin? I think in general, it's true to say that I've been mainly influenced by my dreams and, inner experiences throughout my life. I had, very early childhood experience that made an indelible impression on me when I was about 5 or 6. And now looking back in my mid-70s, I can see how, in a way, that early experience unfolded in my life. And, it provided a kind of, blueprint or something like that, if you like. I know one of the things I've always loved about Jung is that he says we come in not as tabula rasa, but as, highly complex. And then you sort of see that as you realize, or I've realized, probably I've had other lives and this sort of thing. But in this early experience, I was in the garden. It was while I was awake. I was in the garden in Sussex. And
how old were you at this time, sorry?
About 5 or 6.
Right.
And it was midsummer.
Yeah.
So, midsummer in England, or the summer's evenings tend to go very long. And I remember we were all outside, my parents, sisters. Anyway, suddenly everything went incredibly still, as if a great silence descended around everything. And it just went really silent. And then I suddenly saw that everything was suffused with golden light. Everything. I mean, the building, the house, the garden, everything, all of nature was just infused with this gold. And I experienced myself in that moment, not as a child at all, not old or young or anything. It was just a being, some kind of being. And I knew that I'd come from that light, and I knew at some point I would return to it. And then, of course, as I've gone through my life, I've learned there are traditions that talk about this. One of them, of course, being alchemy.
And when I went to India, and I've had an experience a little similar to that, by the way, but it was in that tradition that the home, the spiritual home, one could have that experience of the golden red light in Raj Yoga. That's very much the tradition in India. But I think I don't know, it shifts the reality very strongly, doesn't it? Because
Totally. Yeah.
it pulls one out of, well, what did Shakespeare say? We're all actors in a drama, and then all of a sudden you ride out,
Yes,
and the
you
search
do.
begins maybe to
I
understand.
think in a way it must do, because you suddenly realize, and this is something that, of course, I never talked about. How do you,
Mm,
I mean,
mm,
not till years later in an analytic session did it come up, probably in
yeah,
my late 20s. I never, it wasn't even something I would have even considered.
yeah,
I was in it. It was just a reality. And
mm,
in some respects, looking back, it seemed perfectly normal.
mm,
But of course, it wasn't normal in a way. But as you say, I mean, there's nothing unusual, as it turns out, about
mm,
that sort of experience, particularly in the mystic tradition
mm,
and in sacred traditions around the world. But you don't know that till I didn't know that till later. All I
yeah,
knew was I'd had that experience.
mm,
And equally, I had a very dark experience around that same time, because it was in the same house that we were living in at that time. And I used to sleepwalk a lot. And so often would wake up, and we lived in big vicarages, so there were always spare rooms, and I would just often wake up in a completely different room. But this time I'd slept walked downstairs and bumped into the living room door, which woke me up, and I yelled out, "I'm in the witch's dungeon." And so with the light also came the
mm,
underworld and the
mm,
dark and the witch and so
yeah,
these are again these sort of archetypal themes
mm,
that, again, for me it was through analysis, Jungian analysis specifically, because I had tried others, that these sorts of experiences could be explored, and the larger terrain of the psyche and how one's own little psyche um, you know participated, and how to relate to and make conscious the sort of dynamics and images and experiences of those transpersonal realities.
mm,
So I'm enormously indebted to Jung, and
mm,
he's been, I would say, along with particularly Mary Louise Von Franz, but as well, and others, that really sometimes I think, thank God that I was exposed to that in the 70s, well, actually my teenage years, but also in the 70s.
How did you first become exposed to Jung?
Well, we actually had a couple of books of Jung at home, and I don't even know in retrospect how those got there, because my parents weren't interested at all.
Mm,
But I think there was Modern Man in Search of a Soul. And I think there was another one, Four Archetypes or something like that. These were
yeah.
paperback books at that time. And I remember reading them, and I was just fascinated. And I was just sort of felt myself saying, yes, yes. Oh, this is an interesting perspective. This makes sense. This sort of thing. And I remember also, so all these things are so intertwined. But when I finished my A levels, I had applied to read law. I was going to read law at university.
Yeah.
But after A levels, I went to Israel, and I was on a kibbutz, and because my parents said, well, is there anything you want to do before you go off? And I was quite
Get
surprised by
on the
that.
straight and narrow. You can have a year off before you get on the straight and narrow. That was maybe the biggest mistake they ever made, Veronica.
Oh, I think you
Just
just
giving you
helped me with something there. I didn't quite see it like that. Yeah, well, exactly. Of course, that came through in phase in other ways. But Yeah, so, I was on this kibbutz, and I was just, I sort of grew up in this milieu of Christianity, and my father being a clergyman and in the Church of England. And I'd actually studied religious knowledge, it was called then, for one of my A levels. And I just couldn't make head or tail of what was being taught, really. It just didn't make any sense to me at all. I didn't really feel I learned very much. So anyway, I wanted to go to the source. And so, I was picking apples on this kibbutz, but we only worked in the morning because of the heat. So in the afternoon, a friend and I would go hitchhiking around and visit all the sort of sacred places that I had learned about were the sacred places. And I had two major experiences there. And one was at the Sea of Galilee, where I had an experience of as if I saw through the veil of the world. It was like I saw the world as like a cloth. And it was like this cloth, and through the cloth of the world, the material world, which is very real, it was as if the spirit was expressing itself, but through the world, through matter, through material. They weren't separate. They weren't separate. A bit like, I suppose, my childhood experience.
Can I just say one thing about that though? And this might be jumping ahead a little, but that kind of blows Newton's mechanical universe right out there and then, doesn't it? Because the kind of solid building blocks, it's not quite.
It's not true.
No.
No, not from that perspective,
So it gives one a bit of a puzzle to begin to try to get answers to or something.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can laugh about it now, but that made such an impact.
Yeah.
I thought, what am I doing reading law? I don't want to read law.
Mm.
I want to go and, study theology. I mean, this is what I'm interested in.
Mm.
And then I had another experience at the Dead Sea where I knew it. I was swimming in the Dead. Well, you don't exactly swim in the Dead Sea because it's so salty, but I was floating in it and looking up at the thing. And this was at Qumran, and I just knew. I knew that place, and that was my first conscious experience of reincarnation. I knew that I knew it, and I thought,
where do you feel you've been in? If we spoke, like, it's a dicey area. Past lives. I mean, I've had a similar experience to that, and I call it like a gnosis, just some kind of knowing that only once, of being in a place, and it's like, I've been here. It's kind of deja vu gnosis, a whole lot of things thrown into one or something. But it's a very hard thing to explain. And where do you think you've been in previous births? Do you mind me asking? Just you don't have to over elaborate if you don't want to. Like, if you're Napoleon and killed people or something like that, you can brush over the details. I know I've had some
really boring ones. I'm aware that some of them have been really boring, But I think, to answer your question, a lot of my experience, see, for example, when I go traveling, which I love to, it's a sort of Sagittarius part of me, my rising sign, exploring and learning and wanting to know. I only go to places if they appear in my dreams first. And then when I get there, I often have the experience, not always, but I often have the experience that I already sort of know something about this place. And that was clearly true of Palestine.
Yeah.
Although I didn't have a dream, because I wasn't really focusing on dreams when I was 18. Although I did have one essay when I was 14. We could write about anything we wanted to, and I wrote about dreams. But that was so it was already brewing in there somewhere. So yeah, and then so then I changed, and I went to read theology at London University, where later I discovered my grandfather had studied theology at King's College London. I didn't even know that. My father didn't say anything about it then. It was later. So I thought that was an interesting connection. And then, but anyway, I couldn't stand this theology course. At one point, I said, why aren't we studying the mystics? I said, I'm here because of experiences. And I've read quite a bit of the, mystics, the major mystics, and Teresa of Avila. And why isn't that part of the curriculum?
Mm.
And of course, they laughed at me.
Mm.
They thought, that's not stuff you study it on the university level.
Mm.
So I was very, very disillusioned. But there was one professor, an Old Testament professor, and one of our set books was the book of Job. And he mentioned Jung's answer to Job, and that fascinated me. He didn't say much about it, but he said something about, and I'd already exposed to Jung with these couple of books that I already read. And he mentioned something about Jung and the dark side of God that comes up in that paper. And that just drew my attention. That fascinated me. And so I didn't do anything with it at that time. And I didn't complete my degree like you're supposed to. But I ended up going to New York in my early 20s. And there's a long story behind that, which we don't necessarily have to get into. But I did end up being in New York. And the only place you could learn about Jung in New York, or probably in a lot of places at that time, was in the seminaries.
Right.
So I went to some courses just to signed up for, you could come as an interested person. And there was a professor there who handed me Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And he said, I think you might find this interesting. And I was teaching at my job was teaching at the Cathedral School of St. John the Divine in New York City. And this was the early 70s. It was 72. 72. And so I was teaching in this place, but I was reading Jung. And when I read his so-called autobiography, that completely changed my life in a major way. I thought, I feel home when I'm reading this book. And so that influenced really sort of how things unfolded from there. And
I'd
also,
like to get in. Well, sorry, you go ahead.
no, just to say, being in New York in the 70s was a huge influence on me, because it was the women's movement.
Right.
It was the social justice movement.
It was all happening.
It was all happening. Yeah. It was, people experimenting with drugs, and it was just normal to go to parties and, have brownies with things in them. I mean, it was just kind of normal. Everyone was experimenting like anything. And so that had a huge influence on me as well. I thought, I feel the hand of fate sometimes in places where I've ended up, because it's so helped my journey unfold.
I want to ask you a couple of things. Firstly, this whole idea of the daemon, that there's this guiding daemon. Like, when I hear about your journey, it seems that the guiding hand seems to have been. And I think, you said early on in this conversation, sometimes I think as one gets a little bit older, you look back and you say, oh, what you thought were disparate experiences in your life, like, oh, this was my time in Israel, this was my time in New York, how they kind of start to, you go, oh, it's kind of all, I can see the jigsaw kind of a little better or something.
I so agree with that. And that's, to me, part of the value of getting old, when you look back and you see, what were those influences? You think you're making sane choices, or even insane ones, but
Or
you know,
rational. You think it's rational,
yeah,
but actually it's more demonic or something.
exactly.
Mm.
And you do see what I remember one of my analysts said, you know, it's, you know, individuation is like what you do with the hand dealt, you know.
Mm.
So part of that hand dealt, it seems to me, is also these, I know Jung talks about this, you know, these fateful detours and wrong turnings. And I've had certainly lots of wrong turnings. But you see how they all fit.
Yeah.
And that to me is an extraordinary treasure to
Yeah.
look back and to see, okay, I was only partially
Mm.
consciously making decisions. There was another hand in there.
Yeah.
Some mystery that I don't really understand. And maybe at some point, you know, you
Yeah.
do, or on whatever level. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's life in the end for me is an incredibly deep mystery. And I've always felt that.
I sometimes think of the islands in the Odyssey. You know, he had to go to different islands, and in a way, like he was in the Odyssey, Odysseus was getting blown off course seemingly and going to an island. But it's kind of like maybe one needs the experience there, and then you know
Yeah,
the next island has a different kind of experience, and the next island, and somehow it's bringing the what is it, the range of experiences or
yeah,
something that, and sometimes even if it's a bit of a darker experience or a more, in retrospect you could say, well, maybe I learned even more from that one than some of the
exactly.
really cool ones.
Yeah.
Well, like a dark night of the soul, for example, you don't kind of jump up and down if you're having that. Like you don't go,
No,
oh,
you
I
think,
really wanted to have a dark night of the soul, but but when you
I
look
always,
back, you know,
yeah,
maybe a lot has been learned from that. It strips away uh, lot of the persona and the outward
yeah,
stuff and
yeah,
all that.
absolutely. And, you know, I think those dark nights happen perhaps once every, I think of them happening about every 10 years.
Oh,
It's that
don't say
alchemy.
that.
Well, it's the
I'm just going
alchemy.
to mute this for a second.
Yeah. No, I think, you know, that's why I learned early on that when I thought, you know, in my early 20s, God, I'm making all these mistakes. I haven't done this. I didn't finish that, you know.
Mm,
And it was quite a relief to come to sort of understand that there are no such thing as mistakes.
mm,
These are the great lessons, as you say, that we enter the depths trying to really penetrate what's underneath the so-called
yeah.
mistakes.
And I want to just get back to Jung for a second. Well, you're Jung. It seems to me that you see the mystic in. I don't know why I think that, but it seems that I get from you that you have that strong mystical side, perhaps, or whatever, or the
Mm.
mystic bent or whatever, and also it's impossible to not notice that your family setup is a little bit similar to Jung's, is that he had the father who was a pastor. And so that, I don't know, I think I heard someone say Jung had that running engagement with Christianity for his whole life or whatever, didn't he? And but
Yeah.
what is
Mhm.
it that, you know, what
What
do
I
you
think,
like about Jung?
what do I like about what?
Oh, who is your Jung?
Who is my Jung? Well, I think you said it. I think my Jung is the one who so honored his experiences. And that was always the argument I had with my father. As a teenager, I'd say, what experiences did you have that made you choose this profession? And he couldn't ever really answer that. It used to make him very anxious. And at least that's what I picked up. And at one point, he said that because he'd gone through World War II, you know, and growing up, he and my grandfather used to joke about World War II. They used to say, oh, yes, you know, we played cricket across Europe. And they you know, all the trauma and the
The
horror of it. I think they were worried that they'd pass on this sort of really dark view of the world or something. But so that's what I thought World War II was for the longest time. I mean, it's nuts when I think about it now. But at one point when I got older, I remember it was very moving actually. In his study, he had significantly in the bottom drawer of one of his, you know, on the side of his desk, he pulls out a photograph of one of the death camps that were being liberated. So it was a horrific picture. And he said, you know, you always asked me, he said, I think really the answer was not so much an experience of, he said, I think just experiencing the horrors of war and what people were capable of doing to other people. He said, I couldn't believe that that's all there was to life. And I think he hoped that Christianity and going along that path like his father had, he was following sort of his father's thing, course, that he would find an answer. And interestingly enough, toward the end of his life, my father's life, I remember he shared with Robert and me that he wasn't really ever sure that he believed what he'd been told about Christianity. And I thought that was incredibly honest, and I really respected him. And I was very moved by that confession. And so I think he really struggled with it. And I think, you know, I think the dark side of Christianity, of evil, is certainly what we're faced with in spades today and this past century. And, you know, here we are, forced to, well, I don't know, Von Franz said about evil, she said somewhere, you can't engage with it. You cannot. You have to acknowledge almost respectfully, but then you don't go there. And the only way, and I think this is probably true, that you can deal with evil on a personal level is through your own shadow. And I think that's why Jung's work on the shadow is probably, for me, such an important contribution. I mean, it's so huge, and we look at the world and we still have a long way.
What do you actually mean though, Veronica? The only way to deal with evil is through one's own shadow. Can you expand upon that a little?
Well, I don't know how on a personal level one can deal with what you see in the collective. I mean, I suppose I'm of the opinion or perspective that it's too overwhelming because it's too dark to try and take it on. It would draw you in, you know. And so, but there's certainly enough in one's own shadow side, dark side, to work on. And to me, that's always an ongoing project throughout life. It's not as if, oh, I've worked, you know, now I know my shadow. And, you know, in every advance, every light, there is a darkness. It's just how it's the reality we live in. And also hidden in the shadow are your talents and your creative potentials. And those are often squashed by family influences or educational influences or cultural, you know. That's why it's so important to be aware of, for me, these different levels of the psyche that Jung talks about, the personal, unconscious, and then the cultural and historical, because all these things, all these values and qualities have huge influences on us, you know, when we're born, at what point in, you know, what gender, what what sex, what, all of that matters hugely when you're trying to sort out who you are and what's you, more than what's the values of the collective sort of thing, where you're identified. So
I always think the shadow or the dark
yeah.
is seen as, well, there's just what you were saying, but it can be seen in such a negative light. I mean, it's sometimes it seems easier to go out there and act on the stage than actually deal with some of that. But I know some people call it the gold in the shadow, or I think there's a lot of hidden good stuff hidden away in the shadow that was just come under general unconsciousness or something.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with you about that. There's no question about it. And especially when you can approach what you feel so embarrassed about or want to keep hidden, or
like your mystic side or something.
Like the mystic side. I never call myself that, but yeah, I suppose it's true. Yeah, that, but I think that's actually incredibly common. People have these experiences. In my experience, especially as a psychotherapist, people don't share.
No.
And sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can't. You just haven't got the language for it. So these are the great sort of secrets that we keep. And if you do have a place where you will be received and can, explore what that side of you is really all about, that's just like gold. That's such a gift. But a lot of it, like the alchemists say, it's a they don't tell.
It's always hard to know, isn't it?
Yeah.
But one thing I must say I love about Jung is that he gave a language, or he offered so much language, the unus mundus, the anima mundi, and this and that and that. And I think it somehow gives a way of, I'm not saying that there's still not sometimes you hold things or keep quiet or whatever, but personally, I find that language very liberating.
No, you're right. That's true too. Absolutely. To know that there are these dynamics and levels and qualities and images and figures, and and that your dreams tell you a lot. And absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, he did, and that was, I think, one of the things that he did, which was of great service, was to turn his fire, the fire of his personal and transpersonal experiences, into a language that we could understand and be enormously helped by, to have that language. So I think,
Just getting back to Christianity for a second, and I don't know, I suppose some people may have taken a lot from Christianity as well. But I remember in our family, like my father had been in the Second World War, and he had a mate who was a priest. We were Anglican, Church of England, and the priest would come around, and they'd drink beer, smoke, tell jokes, act a bit ribald, tell war stories, stuff like that. And I used to think as a little kid, it was hard to see the spirit. Even I expected, not knowing anything about spirituality, but it was very kind of, what's the word, profane or whatever. And I don't know, sometimes I think like the language of Jung started to actually have meaning or depth or something, that, the anima mundi is the soul of the world or something like that. And maybe because it's out of the normal system, the language seems a little different. It starts to, it takes you down an avenue of learning or opening or.
Yes, because I think the Christian thing for me was filled with so much dogma, and this is what it is. This is how it is. And I found that too restricting. And I think you're right. I think Jung, in his experience, opens a much broader landscape and brings in terms that are, as you're suggesting, like the soul of the world and the...
Or a term from alchemy, because it's so, what's the word, lost in history, that it's something like to dig up an old term and then, you know, oh, the nigredo and the rebirth and the albedo, you know, so it's kind of like it gives a whole fresh area of exploration or something.
It does. It does. And it also, I think that's what he said also about alchemy, that it compensated for the Christian, what was lacking or suppressed or oppressed in the Christian myth. It brought in the shadow. It brought in these different stages. It brought in, you know, the union of matter and spirit, rather than the split that, you know, happened in Orthodox Christianity. Real split between spirit and matter.
Yeah.
You know, the spirit was all there was, and you know, the body and all of this was sort of dark and evil, and so I think, and it brought in the feminine, because that, you know, Sophia is a guide and sort of goddess of alchemy too. So it brought in the divine feminine side, the, you know, the lost goddess of Christianity, if you like.
So what does that mean? What does that mean to you, the lost goddess of Christianity?
Well, I think, you know, I think that's been a huge problem, not only in Christianity, but in the West in general, because she was sort of taken out. Well, it depends how you do the dating, but I think probably around, what was it, around 2000 BC or 21, somewhere in there, the Gilgamesh epic, I think it is, where, you know, the trees start to be cut down, the goddess starts to be cut off, and then you know, in terms of the Old Testament, you know, God, certainly in the wisdom literature, had a partner, Sophia, co-creator of the world, in some of the texts, and you know, I think it was at the first destruction of the temple in Jerusalem around 600 BC or so. She was, all her statues were knocked down. So you know, she was expunged. And I think for me, this separation between, in the Godhead of the feminine and masculine sides, if you like, the opposites in the divine, yeah, got separate, and that led to all kinds of problems that downloaded into culture. And you know, so that when Jesus comes along, until recently, when the Gnostic Gospels were discovered in you know, in Qumran, and then also in Nag Hammadi in Egypt, where a very different picture of Christianity came forward, where there was a sacred union between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and a whole different story emerged, which of course is still not taught. And they were discovered in 45, so at Nag Hammadi. So, okay, they got translated. That took a long time. But it's still not part of what's taught, that there is this other side to Christianity that does include the divine feminine. Mary Magdalene was considered an embodiment of Sophia. And so, you know, so much deep understanding about Christianity was suppressed from the get-go. I mean, there wasn't even a church till 400 years later. And, you know, reincarnation was part of it until, I can't even remember when that was suppressed in Christianity. So, and, you know, in terms of the Essene communities, women were equal to men. But you get to the mystics, and then you get to the Cathars in this part of the country here in southwest France. They thought the church was corrupt, and they, you know, they believed in the teachings of Jesus and the Magdalene, and you know, it was about healing and service to others, and teaching, and then there was, of course, an initiate's path if you were drawn to do that mystic side of it. And there was a huge genocide to get rid of them. So it's been a fraught history, and some of that, fortunately, now is changing, and some of those stories are being rewritten. And but you know, the institutional church lags a bit behind, I think, catching up with some of these newer disclosures about what Christianity is really about. And so it's still a sort of hierarchical, male-dominated, with exceptions.
So the Cathars, so you're living in the right spot then, in a way, like, you know, the Cathars are where you live. Yeah.
Yes, in that respect. Yeah, yeah.
And what about Egypt? Tell me what you learned about from Egypt. I know you went there.
Well, like you had mentioned earlier on about not many people that you've spoken to doing these podcasts that you do that have spoken about Egypt. And I, you know, I always felt that, you know, Jungian psychology stopped a bit at sort of the Greeks or something. Anyway, I didn't know much about it then. I'm not sure I know a whole lot about it now, but I think there was something that always drew me about sort of the fact that it was so much more ancient then, and this is something that I'm actually fascinated with at the time, at the current time, about how all our datings for everything, for pyramid building and for this, that, and the other, it's all going back in time. Things seem to be much, much older than we ever thought. And I know there is this sort of archetypal fascination with origins, which is also quite interesting in itself. But anyway, yeah, I myself was not particularly interested, but I had a dream, you know, that kind of introduced me to it. And in this dream, there were two things that happened. One was I was given the name Abydos in the dream, which I'd never ever heard of before in relation to Egypt. And then the second one was not a name, but it was an image of a temple on a sort of island, looked like an island, and it was surrounded by water. And when I went to the temple of Isis, which is Philae, it was exactly that. And when I saw it, I thought, so that was the temple of my dream. And so what happened on that that first journey was one of the major experiences I had was at Abydos. And interestingly enough, it was at the Abydos temple. There are 7 small chapels within the temple to major gods and the goddess Isis. But there is also a kind of inner sanctum. And there are 3 smaller chapels, quite small, and dedicated to Osiris, Isis, and Horus. And of course, because, you know, the Osiris myth is the myth of Egypt, death and rebirth. That is the origin of alchemy, alchem. It was the original name. And it was in the chapel, the small chapel of Isis, and I was deeply affected by that chapel. I can't explain it. I was just in this very small, intimate space, and I was looking at the images on the wall, and I was deeply moved. I was deeply moved by what felt like a most sacred feminine presence. I don't know how else to describe it. Words are completely useless, really. But just to say, there was a kind of feeling of her beauty, her soul beauty, and her deeply compassionate presence that sort of emanated out of, I don't know, out of what to say, can't say. And I don't know, I just felt somehow that my dream had indeed led me to Abydos and to Isis. And because I was on a tour and we only spent one day there, I said to myself, I know I'm going to come back here. I know at some point I'm going to come back here. There's something here that I need to pay attention to. And that happened 11 years later when I did go back. And I spent 2 months there and participated in well, always and forever, Abydos has been a healing temple sanctuary, and it's always been an initiating place because of its place, because of where it was built, because of the lore, L-O-R-E, and the legend surrounding the history of that place. It is considered one of the most sacred sanctuaries in Egypt. Now many, many more people visit it than they did 10, 15 years ago. And so I was there for a mystery school, Egyptian mystery school, of the pre-dynastic shamanic mystical tradition. And so that had a, yeah, we talked a bit about that before we started, and that had an enormous impact on me. Yeah. And it was, how to say, how do you can't explain these things. You can only say, this is what happened. And I went through a big process there. And yeah, I suppose I was brought into the reality of the myths of Egypt and the death and rebirth process, and what these temples were always for. And these mystery schools are all over the planet. They're, as we know, Egypt, Greece. So there's always been this placeholder for pilgrimage travel, for transformation, for knowing that death is not the end, and for the death rebirth process, that's what I mean every 10 years. For me, because I always feel I'm a slow learner, it's as if, you have to go through this reminder, if you like, that, you're really not just passing by on this planet in a rather superficial, conscious way. You are part of a sort of long tradition of those who've gone before you and who will come after, of a human journey that involves such depth, if it if it speaks to you that way. And that brings what I think Jung called the meaning of life. I mean, I think experiencing and then knowing and learning from research and reading, and so you're expanding your knowledge all the time, and both inner and outer, is just such a gift. It's a huge gift. It's free.
Yeah. One thing, what I have got from reading your book too, Songlines of the Soul, is that you talk about a new reality that's needed, a wider consciousness, a new reality. And I wonder what you'd say about that now, and maybe particularly after that experience of death, because many people might say it's very much a death, rebirth kind of thing
today.
Culturally.
Mm.
I know Rick Tarnas says that for sure, and it's something that I can respond to a lot. Like, there's so much collapse on one side, but you can also feel the new trying to come through, or whatever, and definitely people expressing and needing to be creative and attempting to express the new. So when you talk about this new reality, how would you talk about it? Like in the present environment, what do you think are some of the main things?
Well, for me, when I looked around and inside, and as I say, that book also came from a dream, and the dream was of, as I write in the beginning of the book, I was going to write a book on extraordinary experiences, but after that dream, it changed, because I had this dream that linked me to this Persian mystic, Suhrawardi, from the 12th century. And when I researched his story, he was a philosopher, a logician, but he also was a visionary. And he had a whole theory of light. And but he believed in what he called the imaginal world, had other names for it. And he was imprisoned for this belief, saying that there was this visionary world that was real, but in another way. And he was basically killed for his belief in the imaginal realm. And so that, of course, influenced, first of all, a deeper exploration of him and his work, but also that somehow this imaginal world, this world between spirit and matter, that Jung alludes to in Alchemy when he says that the goal of alchemy is the creation of the subtle body. And this is the philosopher's stone. And it comes from these transformative things that we've been talking about, and all the levels and everything in alchemy that Jung helped us see was part of this individuation process, and a sort of template for it, if you like. But it was this between realm that has its own ontological reality. And because of my experiences in life, I knew about that world in my own way, not necessarily directly as Suhrawardi described it, and I knew it was a reality. It wasn't something just to be symbolically interpreted, that it was a direct experience of another reality in this one. And you couldn't reduce it to any, I mean, you can elaborate archetypal symbols. Okay, that's helpful. But also it was not just an as if, something to be approached as if, which is sort of symbolic reality, which is also enormously helpful to have that notion of course. But this was another realm. So to me, it was these levels of consciousness, with conscious, personal, unconscious, cultural, historical, collective. And Jung went as far as the psychoid, where I think he was really talking about this realm, the psychoid being this unus mundus world, where in synchronicity you see the two absolutely join non-locally, spirit and matter. Hugely, hugely important, hypothesis of his, as he calls it, because for me, that points not only to the direct experience of the imaginal world, but how is this imaginal world emerging more collectively into culture and history? And how does it relate to this indigenous notion, for example, that we are at the ending of a massive cycle of cosmic history, literally in the Kali Yuga, literally in the darkest dark of the dark moment. And, you know, what are what I call signatures? What are the signatures of a new birth, a new reality trying to come through at the same time? Because I agree with you, that's how I see it. There's tremendous collapse and horror and these endless wars and these right-wing moves that are just horrific. And at the same time, you know, there are these experiences that people are having all over the place that point to another reality. And I would include in those near-death experiences, because so many people have reported on them. I remember reading about them in the 80s, where the first literature about near-death experiences came into Kenneth Ring and these people. And there was some confluence in people's experiences in which they were in another reality, not based on time space, because some of them were clinically dead, and they were having varieties of similar sorts of transpersonal and cosmic sort of experiences, where they came back a bit like mystery school, where you come back knowing there is no death, knowing you do not have to fear death because it's a transition, it's a new birth into another reality. And you yourself change. You become a spokesperson for that realm. You Eben Alexander, who was a well-known, neurologist at Harvard or something, who should have died and who did die, came back and completely changed. Like, so many examples of people like that who come back and try to give voice to this other reality that they know is not just a dream. They know it's completely real. It's, in fact, they mostly say it's realer than, this 3D reality that we partly live in. And yeah, so that was, I felt that was a very good example of a cultural thing, because it wasn't just one person, it was loads of people. So that was, and for me, since the mid-40s, the whole experience of our connection with civilizations not of this earth is something that's also been growing. And that the American government at the end of 23, going into 24, said, yes, we've been lying for 80 years. We do have these files and so on and so forth. But quite apart from governments professing this, loads and loads of individuals have also had these sorts of experiences that are also experienced often as initiation into a new order of reality, and where they sometimes endure very intense psychic, physical experiences, but where they are shown, often pictures of the horrors that we're doing on the earth, and what really we should be paying attention to, and opening our hearts and moving toward compassion and love for the earth. It's not about going off onto some other planet. It's about how we need to care for our home planet, Earth, because the devastation that we're wreaking everywhere is affecting other planets, other civilizations in the galaxies. And then we have the Webb, the photographs coming from space, the James, what's it, telescope. So it's as if, and this is something else that that I loved about what Mary Louise Von Franz says at some point. She says, we need a vaster vision of reality in our time. it's too limited, it's too myopic. And so what I see is that people are doing more and more spiritual travel. They're being drawn to sacred sites. They're looking for their own spiritual experiences. They're having their own spiritual experiences. They don't need orthodox intervention necessarily to help them with their own spiritual lives. You know, there's plant medicine that people are wanting to expand their consciousness.
Yeah.
There's Jungian psychotherapy and analysis.
There's many
other sorts.
so many different ways.
Yes. And I'm just, and then the other thing for me are the crop circles. And, you know, people just dismiss these things as hoaxes. Well, okay, but I'm of the opinion that, this is where I agree with Jung, it's not so much causes and where things come from, it's what's the meaning of them. So his perspective was always, you know, moving forward. And he said this in his UFO essay. And he said that, you know, if these are new archetype, if these are images of new archetypal constellations coming in with Aquarius, we should be paying attention and trying to understand, even if we don't. Because if we judge them prematurely, we will energize their destructive side. If we can look at them with a kind of dispassionate eye and try to understand what might be happening here, then we might help with the new age that is trying to be born at the same time, namely Aquarius.
I think Lawrence Hillman said the other day, you know, I don't profess to know much about astrology, Veronica, but you know, in Aquarius, like in that new Aquarian energy, there's so much that's, well, in my language, so different in a way from the old structure and the old establishment and the old official and all of this. And it's kind of like, and it's just coming so fast, you know, that it's to find some way of, what's the word? Not that there shouldn't be discernment, but of opening to that, that new kind of energy, let's put it that way. Because as you say, it's happening with so many people in so many different ways. Everywhere.
So true. It's so true. And that, you know, that isn't on the evening news.
No.
You know, it's vastly hidden, except when you yourself are interested, and then you begin to find, like the astrologers that I always find enormously helpful, both in personal life and also in, you know, in collective life. And what they're saying about this year and the next 2 years is just mind-blowing. You know, and you look around the world and you think, well, how is any, really? That can't be possible, you know. But yeah, I value astrology highly because of the perspective that it can give us. That can show us both the light and the shadows of what is emerging. And yeah, I wish I knew more about it, but I value, you know, Rick, and I don't know much about Lawrence Hillman's work, but there are some great UK astrologers.
Liz Green, for one.
Yeah, Pam Gregory is very good too. But there are others, you know, and it's just so enormously helpful to have us, you know, as we started out, a bird's eye view of these cosmic energies that are somehow miraculously resonating and attuned to our history and culture and unfolding as on little old planet Earth.
I think one thing is how there are people, you know, for example, I was saying to someone the other day that I always thought Saturn was such a bad thing, you know, the Saturnian, the old, but, you know, with the astrology, like, again, you know, when I was a young person, astrology was a very, in my world, you know, was a very out there kind. Like, if I had said it in the bar in Western Australia, you know, I probably would have got in a fight, you know.
I just had my chart read, yeah.
that I was
Yeah,
being
they probably
moved
knocked
by
it
the
over or
moon or
something.
something. Yeah, they would have
Yeah,
said, what have you been taking or something? But it's kind
exactly.
of like this depth of appreciation of the different energies, which are like different gods and like different archetypes. And for example, the both sides of Saturn, the one side that actually deepens one or whatever, or the different sides of Venus or, Mars, or it it's something that can help you understand those things much, much more, which are, I would say, fundamental energies which are moving us and guiding us all along the way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
Mm.
And yeah, I mean, Saturn, it's interesting how some of these planets get such bad press, as you say, because, Saturn, okay, sometimes restriction is good
Yeah,
because it forces you to focus and see a project through when
yeah.
you want to give up on it and stuff like that, So,
And scholars can do with a bit of Saturn sometimes. And COVID as a kind of, as a kind of restriction anyway. I don't know whether,
yeah,
it was actually connected, but it's kind of like, how many people started new things because of that restriction,
I know. It was if you could approach COVID as
Mm,
a sort of forced contemplation period, your time in
mm,
a monastery,
yeah.
it's amazing what people did.
Mm,
Absolutely incredible.
mm,
And yes, it was difficult, so you couldn't make, travel or whatever, but you could be outside. Um, you know, but yeah, it was I did a lot of quite a lot of work that had come up on, various streams and stuff at that time.
mm.
Uh, but sort of my life is pretty introverted anyway, so
But
I
even
guess
for even if your life is introverted, like I might also associate with that. But it's like you didn't even have to make excuses, because it was like COVID was on. So you still, you know, oh, sorry, I can't go there because there's COVID restrictions. Like that was great for introverts.
yeah, exactly. It was like, yay.
It was like a little golden age for introverts, maybe.
Yeah, I know. You had to kind of keep that smile under wraps. No,
Oh,
yeah, that's one of the great things about it, yeah, for sure. And yeah, and also that was, and then of course the Zoom thing blossomed.
yeah,
So you could do a lot of teaching online with, with your
mm,
slippers on. You didn't
yeah,
even have to go anywhere.
mm.
As long as you looked reasonably presentable from the waist up, it was all
I often wear my board, like I've actually got my board shorts on now, but the problem arises when if you have to go and grab something like your
right.
calendar or something like that, then you can get busted. I have been
Suddenly see
busted.
you, oh, you've got your jammies on it, I know there is
And
that funny side to it. It's hilarious.
anyway, I think I know we've gone for some time, but unless Veronica, I was interested in your word signatures, and unless you have, do you have anything to add? Final thought about? I don't know whether I fully understood signatures. What do you mean by that? And a
You
final
know, I
thought on another signature of the future and this wider reality, maybe.
yeah, I don't know.
Sorry.
I kind of came up with that word, and then I actually looked into its origin. And the origin of the word signature is really, really fascinating. And I can't remember what it is
Mm,
in this particular moment. I'll have to look it up and I'll send it to you. But it's sort of the idea of going down a path accompanied by. So that's what I'm remembering. It could be quite wrong, but that's what I'm remembering. Kind of going down a path accompanied by an invisible presence or something like that.
right.
So it actually, in its origin, is quite an interesting word, which is why I then kept it because I thought, oh no, that really makes sense. Yeah, I don't know if I've got any final words.
Yeah.
I, I think it's just I think it's just such a difficult time to be alive in so many ways, and yet there are so many new things
Possibilities at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. It's also a very challenging but also quite exciting time as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
And I don't want to go down on the doom and gloom thing. Because it's like as we know from Jungian, you can't just identify with one pole
No.
of anything. You've got to be balanced, and I think that's very helpful to know that. And that's why I think not only does helping to shift a worldview depend on change within yourself, there's an awful lot you can learn from other people, which
Yeah.
is why, for example, your podcast is so great, because as you were saying early on before we started, that and I appreciate about the ones I've seen is that there are so many perspectives, and so many of them are so damn interesting and helpful in terms of
Yeah.
navigating the
Yeah.
times we're in. And just to know that, okay, we're going through a death, but in alchemy, when it's the darkest hour, it's when the new seed is born. And
Yeah.
I cling to that idea a bit because, well, not only cling, but as we've been saying, there are so many examples of a new
Yeah.
reality that maybe we've never met before on this planet. It's
Yeah.
not just a repeat of something old.
Yeah.
It's a new, some people talk about it as the new human. They're like, there's a new human coming into
Yeah.
being. I think that's very exciting. Like, I don't know how much of that I'll see in my lifetime at this point, but it doesn't really matter.
Jean
But
Houston was
I
onto all
know,
of this, wasn't she? Like Jean Houston really kind of got this 30 years ago or a
yeah,
long time ago, before we're all kind of catching up. The
yeah, exactly.
possible human and all of
Possible.
that.
And
Yeah.
that's now much more in the collective in general, I think.
Yeah.
And it's exciting. And I think it's
Yeah.
exciting to think we'll expand our connection with the galaxies over time, and the other planets and the other civilizations, that some of whom are here trying to help us. And I firmly believe that through experience and other people's experiences. And yeah, why not?
Mm.
The universe is a big place.
Mm. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for sharing. And it's been a pleasure talking to you, Veronica.
Thank you so much for the invitation, John. I've really enjoyed myself speaking with you as well.